Hi, everyone. This is our fifth interview in this series, and the topic is data visualization accessibility. We're privileged to have with us Doug Schepers, who is the director and chief technologist of Fizz Studios. He's an expert with many years of experience in the crucial topic of data visualization accessibility. So thank you for being with us here, Doug.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I want to go into the first question, which is, can we first cover your experiences with data visualization and the different bodies of work that you have developed over the course of your career?
Sure. I started in data visualization per se in, I think, in 2000, around there, 2000, 2001 maybe. I was working for a company called Check Free, and they had a really terrible, they were using a third-party data visualization library that was just terrible. And so I developed a data visualization platform for them. They were the first online check paying service before that was a thing. And let's see. And so I developed a data viz package for them, and I went to work for the the technology I used was SVG, scalable vector graphics. It was just emerging at the time. And then I went to work for the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the web standards organization in charge of, HTML, CSS, a lot of SVG, a lot of web technologies. And so I went there and I worked for a decade doing web standards. So defining these technologies. And while I was there, sort of two things that were significant happened. One, Flash was dying at that time because the iPhone had just come out, and they did not want to be beholden. Actually, the iPhone couldn't even handle Flash, for one thing, and they didn't want their apps to be controlled by a third party, by Adobe, right? And so Flash so they didn't support Flash, and so it started dying off immediately. And I recognized something valuable in Flash, which was that Flash had the ability to do some more advanced audio stuff than what you could do in general on the web. So as Flash was dying, I started a group at W3C to look at basically making like a synthesizer in the browser. It's called a digital signal processor, so that it could generate or analyze audio. Because I thought we were going to need that on the web at some point. And in fact, it has, if you're using sonification at all, which we'll talk about later, you're probably using the Web Audio API, and it's standardized in all browsers, which is great. So that was something I started while I was there. Of course, I was working on SVG, and then I got invited to speak at a conference about data visualization because SVG was emerging as the data visualization platform, or technology rather. And so I went to speak at this conference, and I wanted to have a topic that was not really front of mind for most people at the time. This was in 2012, and OpenVisConf, and I spoke about accessibility and data visualization because I thought it was probably something that all these very technical, very smart people weren't thinking about at the time. And I got a really great response for my talk. And I thought, you know what? This is actually something really significant. These people are thoughtful people. They care about portraying information. And they asked me, okay, so how do we actually make our data visualizations accessible? And I had some hints and tips, but it was not, I didn't really have great answers at that time. And so a few years later, when I left W3C, I thought, well, there's a few different areas I could go into. And one of them, the one that I thought would probably be the highest benefit to society and most satisfying to myself, was accessible data viz. So I went into that. And along the line, over the years, I've dabble in pretty much every kind of accessible data visualization. At that talk that I gave, I think I probably made the first sonification that was built using all web technologies. Certainly not the first sonification, but the first one that was built using web technologies. And I'll demo that in a few minutes. I still have a working version of that. And I've done everything from tactile graphic maps. I haven't myself done stuff with 3D printing, though that's a good technique. I've worked with sonification. I've worked with audio tactile maps. I've worked with haptics, vibration-based stuff. And now my company is sort of concentrating on self-describing charts, things using machine learning to describe charts to automatically generate accurate and meaningful descriptions of charts, which are especially useful for live charts, live data.
And that's an amazing background, and like to hear about the sonification with W3C. That's incredible. So I want to then.
I don't know much about sonification. I don't know much about audio myself. I'm not an audio engineer. I just ran the group. Some other brilliant people who they did the technical work. I know how to use the API, but I couldn't have designed it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I do want to segue then, talking about data visualization accessibility, of course, our topic. Can we cover what are the best practices when considering all types of users across the different accessibility spectrums? For example, what considerations should be made for cognitive load, low vision users leveraging screen readers?
Sure. First off, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but first I want to say, when I first started talking about data visualization, if you go back and look at articles on making your data visualizations accessible, even in the standards at the time, pretty much the only thing that was being talked about 6-7 years ago was color choices and color blindness. Absolutely, color vision deficiency, CVD, color blindness. It's a real thing, and it's a real consideration. But that was pretty much where it stopped a few years ago. Was people were trying to make sure that their colors were good. And so I want to thank you for not even mentioning that, because that's it's not that it's not important. It's among the least interesting aspects of making data visualizations accessible. So I'm going to share my screen. So let's talk a little bit about accessible data visualization. I have a few slides. Specifically going to be talking about patterns, showing patterns in financial information. And again, my name is Doug Schepers. I work for Fizz Studio. We are a small startup that specializes in making data visualization accessible. First, I want to talk about something called cognitive load. So this is relevant in more than just data visualization. Cognitive load, a lot of people think of it as, how much information am I, how much information do I have to process? Is it too much information? And that's a real consideration, but the term cognitive load actually comes from a researcher in Australia who was looking at cognitive load in pedagogy, in education. And they were looking specifically, there were a lot of theories about the best way of teaching somebody, different how people learn. Are you a visual learner? Are you all these things, right? And they thought, well, these are all good theories, but they need to be tested. And so cognitive load theory emerged as a field of study that actually looked at how people, students specifically, how people process information, how they learn. And it looks not just at, is there too much information? It looks at things like, how is the information sequenced? How are you doing something called chunking and loading? In other words, chunking and automating, rather. How are you letting somebody build up the building blocks and then using them once they've got sort of a muscle memory for them? When you first learn to drive, if you don't live in New York and you actually have learned to drive, when you first learn to drive, for me, it was a very overwhelming experience. There's this thing, and then one of my feet has to move around, and then there's a sort of a handle over here, and there's all these different things. There's the rules that you need to follow. All of these things were individual pieces of information that I was having to learn each of them all at the same time. And if you just learn one little thing at a time, you can sort of automate that. So now when I drive, I don't even think about the mechanics of how to operate the car, or even like what side of the road to be on, what that sign means, what to do when a car is approaching from this direction. I don't think of any of that, right? It's all automated. And that's what's known as chunking and loading. And there was a certain point at which you saw a data visualization, you saw a line chart or a bar chart, and you were 6 years old and you had no idea how to interpret that, right? You had no idea what it meant. But at some point you learned, right? And because you learned how to do that, you now don't even think about how to interpret a line chart or a bar chart. You just think about the information, the patterns, right? You've chunked and automated all of this stuff. And so that's sort of where, with cognitive load theory, they start looking at how students actually learn. And not only are they being overwhelmed by the information, are they being underwhelmed by the information? I was bored a lot of the time in school, and I lost so much stuff because I wasn't paying attention, because they didn't properly encapsulate the information. They didn't give me the relevant cognitive load. They didn't give an appropriate amount of cognitive load for all the students, right? And so fortunately, over the years, they've gotten much better at education. And part of it is through cognitive load theory, figuring out how the brain processes information. So obviously, there are specific considerations for data visualization, cognitive load, and disabilities. For example, cognitive load affects everybody, but the effects are magnified in many people with disabilities. For example, in blindness, they've got sequential data point access. In other words, if they're using a screen reader, imagine a data visualization, a line chart is basically like a data table, right? They hear one value, then they hear another value, then they hear another value, they hear another value, they hear another value. This puts a real tax on their memory, right? It's much harder to recognize patterns when they're just one at a time, right? And people with low vision, and by the way, there are far more people with low vision than there are people who have no vision, the people who are totally blind. They use a technique called zoom and pan. They zoom out for the big picture, for the gist, for where things are located, what the general trend is, etc. And then they zoom in to see the details. And so they have somewhat limited overview and recall capabilities, right? And so then once they're zoomed in to see the details, so they can read what's on the screen or see the differences, they will pan the interface around so that they can take in more details. This is really important when you are considering, if you make changes to something. Somebody with a screen reader, they may not see that when you selected this this item over here, that this thing over here has changed, right? You selected this data point here and it updates this chart over here. They may not notice that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I'm going to illustrate how data visualization is still really useful for people with low vision in just a minute. Then there's cognitive disabilities. This is a real catch-all category. A wide variety of effects: memory and attention management. There's a strong impact by cognitive load by cognitive load can have a really big impact on people with cognitive disabilities. They might be distracted from the details and goals. They may be more literal minded, might not get metaphors quite as well, for example. Visually, like their cognitive load, technically, some aspects of dyscalculia and dyslexia can also fall into this category. There's a whole bunch of things that can add up, and there are lots of different phenomena. So when you're talking about cognitive load, you start talking about things more around keeping interfaces simpler, keeping interfaces more focused so that they don't get distracted, so that they can process the information. And I want to point out something that may not be obvious, but data visualizations are not primarily visual. They're primarily structural. So we aren't just like counting blocks that have been stacked up when we're looking at data visualization. We're looking at the relationships. We're looking at patterns. We're looking at trends. We're finding outliers. These are the kinds of things that really help data visualization shine. And I'm going to give you an illustration of that. I like to say that data visualization is, some people say that making data visualization accessible is difficult. And, there are certain challenges to it, but I would claim that data visualization itself is assistive technology. It's a cognitive assistive technology for those of us who can't look at this data table of the population of the 4 biggest countries on Earth, right? Brazil, China, India, and the United States, and can't just immediately see a pattern in there. Mona, can you tell me which of these countries has the highest rate of growth in population?
It would take a lot of me navigating the table and
Yeah.
Like I can't tell you like this. It would take like a lot of effort.
Right. So now if I showed you this line chart of actually much, much more information, this goes back to 2016. This line chart goes back to 1700, right? What do you think which one has the highest rate of growth? Not the highest growth, not the highest population, but the highest rate of growth.
You can tell from the curve of the graph that it was India. It was like shaped.
That's exactly right. And the interesting thing, I was giving this particular slide, I was showing this at a conference, and a friend of mine, Wayne Dick, who has low vision, was sitting in the audience. He was sitting right up front. And I said, which country has the highest rate of growth? And he said, the green one. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, he's a mathematician, okay? But he could tell just by looking at the screen which one of these had the highest rate of growth. He couldn't read the screen, right? He couldn't read that it said India, but he could say the green one, right? Mm-hmm. And that really shows you the difference between a blind person and a low vision person, right? A low vision person can really benefit. Like if I asked him to do the same analysis on the data table, he'd have a really hard time with that, a much harder time than you, right? You already said it would take you longer, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have to do the analysis. He'd have to be zooming and panning and, probably have a running calculator or something like that, right? A spreadsheet would help with that, but it's not the immediacy of just looking at data visualization. That is assistive technology. It helps those of us who don't just picture numbers or who don't understand inherently the relationship of the numbers and find these patterns automatically. I think there are people who can do that, but most of us can't. And that's where data visualizations help those of us who don't have astounding cognitive abilities to see these patterns. It's much easier to notice and think about patterns. It aids certain kinds of cognitive disabilities and low vision. For example, somebody with ADHD has a much easier time looking at the chart and discerning it than looking at a series of numbers and thinking of the operation. But maybe more importantly, it helps reduce effort and catch attention in this, data flooded world, right? If I just saw that table, my eyes might just, like glaze over, right? But I look at the line chart and I immediately get the gist and I can move on. And it helps create a functional model of the data in the minds of the audience. There's lots of different ways of portraying this data, but having a line chart in particular is a really good one because it is a particular kind of vocabulary that we have learned and we can apply it and understand greater. There's nothing inherently visual about that. I could also, for example, describe the trends in text, right? But the point is that the visual thing helps process the raw numbers. So I want to talk a little bit about blind users and screen readers because your audience may not know much about it. So how do blind people use the web? They use software called a screen reader. I've mentioned screen readers before. This literally reads the text on the screen to them. And if there are controls, it tells them about the controls. It tells them what they need to fill out. I say controls, input fields, buttons, things like that. It aids navigation. You can kind of think of it as an interactive audiobook. In HTML, for example, there's an image element, and each image element has an alt attribute for describing the text, for describing the image. And this is hidden from the user usually. You can usually see it on a desktop computer or laptop by mousing over an image. It will often pop up the alt text. On a mobile, there needs to be a more explicit button that says show the alt text. But anyway, we call this alt text. And so the alt text for this particular image might be a blind screen reader user at work. But depending on what I'm emphasizing here, maybe do I want to mention the fact that there's a seeing eye dog behind her? Do I want to mention that there's somebody using a cane in the office behind her? Do I want to mention that it looks like she's using some sort of spreadsheet or some sort of UI, similar UI on the screen? What are the important things, right? If I'm talking about, animals in the workplace, I have a completely different alt text than that. I'd say here, there's a golden retriever, sitting behind behind a blind person's chair at work. These are different. The alt text, it depends on what you're trying to say. You have to figure out what in the image you want to emphasize and highlight. And so that's saying what you add and what you omit is a really important thing. Let's see. What do we have next? I don't want to get ahead of us because I know you have another question coming. And that leads us into the issue of what is the aim of data visualization. There are two main kinds of data visualization. There's exploratory data visualization and there's explanatory data visualization. Exploratory data visualization, that's where we have some data, we don't know what's there, we're trying to look for patterns in that data. Explanatory data visualization is where we already have an opinion about what's in the data. We've selected some subset of the data, we've highlighted or emphasized particular things, and we're really telling users a story about that data. So explanatory data is relatively easy because if you already have in mind, is relatively easy to make accessible, because if you already have in mind what story you're trying to tell, you can just tell them the story, right? And you probably are. You're probably writing an article about it, or you can put a caption there. Explanatory data visualization is pretty easy because you are representing a particular interpretation of the data. Exploratory data visualization is harder. And a lot of financial information is about is trying to find those patterns, right? So in financial data, it is a particular consideration to try to find those unknown patterns when we don't know what's there. I think that might be, yeah, that is, and that's where we're going to pause for the next question.
Mm-hmm. So we've set up a good premise with the theory and the background for data visualization. So now, taking a more pragmatic spin, what accessibility chart techniques have you worked with or are planning on working with? How far along do you believe these techniques are? For example, sonification.
Yeah. So the first time I ever saw or heard sonification was a blind physicist named John Gardner demonstrated at a conference, an SVG conference, where he was demonstrating this technique on a desktop platform. This was a few years before I made my own sonification example at that conference, and it was inspired by him. And I'm really happy because right now I'm doing consulting with John with his company View Plus, and we're sonification is one of the things we're working on. So here's an example. This is actually a slightly updated version of the sonification I demoed, gosh, a little more than a decade ago at this point. All right, so as I move my finger along the trackpad here, housing markets in 2008 remembers that low volume, and then going for 2010, it's rising 2011, it's almost back up to where it was. That general technique is sonification, what people think of as sonification. There are other techniques I'm going to mention, but this is really good for giving a gist, just giving a quick overview of the data by itself without a way of like pausing and getting a real value, like a text value. It's of limited utility. It is also something. Well, let's just talk a little bit about the limitations of sonification. I love sonification. The way I love my cats. They can be. I really do love my cats, but they can be noisy. They can grab my attention at times I don't want them to. They require a lot of attention. So sonification is a little bit like that. It is really great for giving a gist, for giving a high level overview. It's good for identifying trends or outliers or thresholds, right? It is not good for precision. Just like with color, we actually have difficulty mapping semantics to small differences. Big, bold colors that have high contrast, those are great. But when we start getting into very small color values, that's a challenge, right? And it's the same thing with sonification. When you start getting into, the difference between this frequency or that frequency, it's not really very precise. And it's ephemeral. It can be time sensitive, or time intensive rather. It can take a good amount of somebody's time to explore an interface that's focused primarily on sonification. I think it's good as an accent, like animation. I would claim that sonification typically requires typically requires training to use it properly, and I would argue maybe too much training. I use it sparingly to manage attention, like I use animation. And for precision, you have to rely on voice or braille. That's just the reality. But it is useful, and you should just use it to balance your verbal and non-verbal cues. It includes things like voice interfaces and audio tactile examples. I want to talk a little bit about. Oh wait. Well, there's actually another kind of sonification called ear cons, and all your audience is probably familiar with these, and they use them every day. This is like a brief, non-verbal, distinctive audio sound that represents a specific event or conveys feedback or other information to the user. So, for example, like use cases are indicating event state, confirmation of errors. Event state might be things like crossing a threshold, for example. Confirmation or errors, notification alerts, a landmark. You can set a landmark tone to sort of like, basically let somebody know they have arrived someplace, or let somebody know that they have arrived at a particular state. A lot of people use it for sonic branding as well. That's an interesting technique. There's three main kinds. These are all loosely based under the category of sonification. Sonification proper is what I just showed you. Then there's techniques like ear cons, auditory icons, and spear cons. Ear cons, these are abstract. They're structured sounds. They're learned by association. In other words, they don't mean anything by themselves. They don't, like, you just get the impression from them. And they're like the least representative sound. And so something like, I don't know if you could hear that, the sound of a mail being sent, right? You may not have even realized what was going on, because you may have, it's just in the background, right? You may have not realized I was actively playing the sound of an email being sent, because you hear it all the time. Auditory icons, by contrast, they're very, very similar, but they are more skeuomorphic. They're more natural sounds. They're sort of sonic caricatures of the act that you're doing. And they're a little bit more distinct. So that's an ear con, right? An auditory icon is more like this, right? It's like crumpling up a piece of paper that you're going to throw away, right? It's, again, as I said, a little more skeuomorphic. And finally, you have spear cons, which is sort of an interesting experimental technique that some sonification researchers claim is really effective, but I think it has limited utility, especially because, I'll just show it to you first. It's compressed speech. It requires less cognitive aid, but it's not really widely used. It is reportedly pretty distinct. So here's an example of a spear con.
Elevator,
right? Really quick, very brief, like, very brief, very quickly spoken sound, and it might actually be abbreviated, etc. But one reason this is not as useful as ear cons and auditory icons is it is language specific, right? First, you have to generate them, but also the sound of a mail being sent means the same thing to a Spanish speaker, a native Swahili speaker, whatever. They all know what that sound means. They might not recognize what a spear con means. So those are some different, like, sonification techniques. There is a whole field. There's some great work being done. There's some great work being done in Georgia. Is it the Georgia Institute of Technology? I think so. Dealing with sonification, and a lot of people are playing with sonification now. I think that it is. I think, again, it is something that is really good to use in moderation. One place I would use ear cons or auditory icons. I call them all ear cons, just for ease. Like those are good for things like when something has crossed the threshold, either bad or good, right? Like let's say a stock price has has risen to a point where you set an alert, right? Hearing that, oh, bing, that thing go off. And if you know what that sound means, you can act really quickly on it. It's just something to cut through any of the other soundscape that we've got or attentionscape that we have and alert somebody to a specific thing that they need to act on. So there are a few other techniques I'm going to talk about that I've used in the past, or I'm actually probably using currently. There's vibro audio interfaces. I worked a little bit on this when I worked at W3C, not a lot, but I did help a bit. This usually this is like it vibrates the entire phone, but when your finger's on a particular point, it feels like you're actually moving, like it feels like you like a tactile response. So if you have a little spot and you move your finger over it, you can feel like if the phone buzzes right when you move your finger over that, your brain says, "Oh, there's a bump there." There's not, but your brain sort of feels like there's a bump there. So these are usually low resolution, but it does work. I actually I've talked to some people about these tactiles, and actually some people have basically said they don't think that tactile surfaces are the future. They think that tactile gloves are the future, because with so many people investing in virtual reality, augmented reality, there are a lot of people experimenting with making gloves that let you feel things, and because those are more likely to become like more there's just a larger market for people who will be using XR gloves versus specialty accessibility devices that might actually be an interesting market to get into in terms of this tactile stuff. And then there's the stuff, then there is, no, I've kind of gotten lost. Yeah. The audio tactile things, like this is a map of Vancouver, for example, right? And the notion here is that I would either have a screen that has raised pins on it, and these are we're right on the verge of having these tactile interfaces, right? There's a few things coming out in the next few years that are going to be like that are going to be commercial grade tactile interfaces. These are only intended for people who who they're not intended for a general audience. They're intended for people with disabilities. There was another technique though. It's called embossing. It's where you take a piece of paper and you print it out and you raise parts of the surface. And this is pretty common in education, for example. And so you'd have an interface like this. You'd actually have a piece of paper printed out that has these raised surfaces. You'd put this on top of a touch screen. And as you move your finger around on the touch screen, it will talk to you. It will say, hey, this is this particular road. Or maybe it'll give you an ear con, like you go over the water, you hear a little wave sound. You go over the airport, you hear an airplane taking off, things like this. And tactile interfaces actually are really, really useful for blind people. Unfortunately, they also require like specific physical hardware. So we don't use them as much on the web, right? It requires some sort of physical interface. So we don't use them in general on the web, notwithstanding the idea of these raised pin tablets. So those are some of the techniques, the modalities that I've used. I would say the most universal one, though, is is alt text. The most text, like description, like auditory, like verbal descriptions. Those can be read in Braille. Those can be listened to by people who are blind but still have their hearing. They they are pretty universal. They can even be interpreted. And I think in general, let's see, do I have? Yeah, let's talk a little bit about alt text for charts. Alt text is really it's sort of the fundamental technique. So having a textual description of a chart is going to be the most accessible way most people can use a chart. So you can provide alt text, or better yet, a summary. I say better yet because it's better to have the same text visible to everybody, because if somebody has a cognitive load issue, they can see it too. They don't need to necessarily use a screen reader to hear the summary of the chart. And the technique I like to say, and this is specifically applicable to explanatory data visualizations where you already know what's going on, right? A good rule of thumb is compose the alt text like you're describing the chart to somebody over the phone. Pretty simple. But my friend Amy Cecil has a really good definition that goes a little bit more in depth. She says she has a blog post writing alt text for data visualization, and she says the form should be chart type of data where reason for including chart, and then suggests you include a link to the data source somewhere in the text. So an example of this particular bar chart might be bar chart of global competitive infrastructure index for different countries, where the United States is tied for 4th place. Okay, so why do I mention the United States? Why, Mona, why do I mention the United States specifically?
Because you want to give the reason for why you included the chart in that page.
Yes, that's good. And there's another more subtle aspect. Why do I say it's tied for 4th place?
Well, first of all, it's highlighted in the chart.
That's it, right? That's it. You're telling a story about the data, right? And the main point of the story is I mentioned the United States because that's the bar that was highlighted, right? I could go through each individual one, right? I could give them a data table for each individual value, country and value, but that's not what the chart is saying. What the chart is saying is the United States occupies a specific position, and without going into like increasing somebody's cognitive load by telling them each individual thing and trying to tell them, force them to figure out the pattern, I just tell, I jump to the punchline, right? I tell them what I'm trying to tell them in the chart. Now, if they want to go through each individual one, that's great. But I specifically gave them the context of, United States is the thing that we're talking about specifically here, and here's where it ranks, right? That's the gist. And alt text is really, really useful for, as I said, explanatory charts. It is not as good for other kinds of charts. It works really well for simple overviews, casual reading, static charts, things that don't move around. In other words, things that aren't live updated. Simple charts and diagrams. It doesn't work as well for task-oriented data exploration. Dynamically generated charts, things that are live update feed charts, complex charts and diagrams. So these are sort of things that can pretty easily overwhelm a user without some contextualization, right? Without some interpretation. So that's what we're doing, by the way. That's we're working on solving the problem of how to automatically summarize, how to create alt text effectively, and interactive text for scenarios like that. And let's see. Where are we? Okay. I want to mention something else before we move on. you may have heard that the expression that, and I think I've used it here, that data visualization is a story about data. And that's one good metaphor for it. I have another functional metaphor, which is that data visualizations are a user interface for the data. And different kinds of data visualizations are optimized for performing different tasks, like comparison of one value to the whole, or comparison of one data point to other data points, or trends over time, breaking down categories, doing filtering and sorting operations, connection between items, navigation and focus. These are all things that these are tasks that particular data visualizations are suited for. And that's why we use, like in financial data, you use candlestick charts, right? Because it's a particular way of conveying complex data. And so that's, then that's a mission statement. And I don't need to talk about that. Oops. And then one specific technique I'm going to talk about that is focused not on screen reader users, but basically everybody, it works on the principle of the split attention effect in cognitive load theory. And that says that closely related information should be placed together in space and time. So here we have two examples, same chart. On the left, we have a legend where science, math, and arts have a particular color and shape that's located down below. And when I look at it, I'm looking at the chart. Okay, remember that science is the red circle. I go up here, I look at that, and I remember that it's science, and it crosses over math and arts. I have to keep consulting. I have to keep my eye moving down and consulting. And that's actually impeding my ability to just ingest the information, right? Because the key, I either have to remember it or I have to consult it, and I have to remember what thing stands for what. But if I just put the label directly on the chart, right, directly on the chart itself, it is demonstrably better and faster for somebody to process data with things like this. And I'll also emphasize that this goes for particular temporal points. Like if you have something you want to emphasize in a chart at a particular date, right? Like this was the 2008, a housing crisis crash, right? Just put that as a label in the chart right there so that people know, oh, this is keyed to this particular event. And it will help people process things much, much faster. So that's a visual technique that I strongly encourage. If you label the data directly, it removes the need for legend, usually. It helps people with low vision and color vision deficiency. And it aids people with cognitive disabilities, with memory or abstraction. So that's some specific techniques that I've used and some specific technologies and a few tips. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Very thorough answer. So then now taking these tips, how can we, particularly in the financial and economic sector, really ensure that data is represented in a way that's perceivable to everyone as a first step? What aspects maybe of what exists should be reworked?
I think this might be a good time to actually go into some specific examples that you sent me. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to hide my controls here. Oops. Hide floating meeting control. There we are. All right. So I'm not going to give detailed analyses of any of these things, but I'm just going to sort of talk about some considerations that you might have for accessibility. Okay, so we have candlestick, right? Classic financial financial technique. I see actually they're using a combination of on this chart, they're using a combination of candlestick and bar chart, which is interesting. So, same information, two different ways of encoding the same information, unless I'm misinterpreting that. I think that's what's going on here. First off, this is a live update, right? Uh, you can't expect a screen reader user to just listen to a string of numbers and get some meaning out of that. Maybe a few people could do that, but not very many. Um, uh, Candlesticks are particularly interesting. Well, first off, they're subject to interpretation, right? The very reason that candlestick charts were made in the 1700s, in Japan, they were applied to Japanese rice markets. It was more than just supply and demand. It was how people felt, how rice traders felt about the price, how they felt about the supply and demand. It's very subjective, and even today, there's a lot of interpretation that goes on in candlestick charts. There are all these patterns that people use. There's Harami and is it Doji and what is it? Is it Three Rise Evening or something like this? There are all these named patterns that you see in candlestick charts. So there's a very literal school of interpretation might be, I could take this chart and I could sonify it, and I could let somebody get a gist of that, and that wouldn't be a bad technique. Because we're trying to get more than one factor here, right? We're not just stating a position, we're actually stating sort of a range of values. Maybe and we've also got the color coding. So you could use a sonification technique, for example. It could just go over it. Like I used a single frequency, or I used a frequency, right? And I went, and then, right? But here I could use a combination of tones, for example, for if it's red or green, right? I could use one tone for if it's bearish, and another if it's bullish. So the person would hear the volatility as they're going through it. Wouldn't be able to interpret it very easily, I think, but they could. Places where there are where the bar is particularly large or small, you could have a louder or softer tone as it moves along. So you're not just changing the frequency, you're actually changing like how loud or soft it is. That would be good for a gist, and that could be enough to like let somebody know that there's some specific, like right here, to me, this looks like there's a significant threshold that's being crossed right here, right? There's a big drop, right? And the fact that that would be a particularly loud sound that could like clue somebody in. Oh, I want to actually drill into this information at this point, right? So they get the gist, but then they get that this particular thing was significant, so then they can go in and they can actually listen to the value. Another thing, a technique that you could use is there are all those named patterns. You could actually, rather than have somebody listen to just listen to the sonification, or in addition to it, you could actually list out, the individual patterns in sequence, right? You've got, what is it, enclosed Harami, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You can just list out, okay, it starts with this kind of pattern, then it goes to this kind of pattern on these days, and then this, you could actually list out those individual patterns in a screen reader user without having to. Now they would have to have the specialized jargon, right? They would have to know what that meant. But that's also the case with somebody, a visual user, right? They have to know what those, not just how to identify a pattern, but also what that particular pattern means, right? What the implications of that are for their actions, right? And that's really the key here, right? the key to a chart like this is, what are you trying to get them to do? And you're trying to give them information that they can act on, and probably in a time sensitive way. So that's how I would talk a little bit, think about how to do a candlestick chart. Does that make sense, Mona?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Let's go on to another one. One moment. So here's a case where we have, excuse me, where we have 4 different charts. And I'm going to presume that because they have the same labels, right, on some of them at least, they that they are related to each other in some way, right? Now, this is not going to be immediately obvious to either a low vision user or to a screen reader user. So here's a case where I would say, if there are specific, some specific information that is in different charts, right? That you would want to make it easy for a person to go to sort of filter the information, to like find all the information about, Arbitrum or Polygon or Ethereum, find all of that in one pattern of information. I want to emphasize that we're talking about financial stuff here. These techniques are not specific to crypto. They're not specific to financial. This is just data visualization user experience. Is nothing. I couldn't speak intelligently to any of the like the specific subject matter. I'm just talking about general techniques. So I would basically make it possible for them to understand where to be able to go between different charts to get the same piece of information at different time points, for example. That's a general technique I would suggest for one of these dashboard type applications. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, especially the filter, because some of the colors you saw in the key, those were representative of different chains. So absolutely, it makes sense to like either filter or toggle by chain and have the data be able to sort itself that way as well.
Great. So here we have another giant dashboard, and this is just beautiful, right? This is a classic example of information overload. So many things on this one dashboard, but so there's a particular thing in cognitive load theory where they talk about the expertise reversal effect. In general, my advice is simplify, right? If you have one chart that has 2 different pieces of information in it, if you can split those apart meaningfully, do so, right? But if I did, there's a point at which you've got diminishing returns. Somebody who really knows how to interpret that, and by the way, I'm not somebody who really knows how to interpret these particular charts, right? But if I were, I presume that all of these things are pertinent pieces of information that a person using this dashboard, they're going to want to be cross-referencing really quickly between them, right? Like they might look at a particular piece of information, and even though to me, an outsider, it doesn't look like it's related to somebody who really knows how to read the markets. Maybe they need all of this information. Now, this is a lot of information in one place. But again, I think it comes down to that ability for somebody to gather all the pieces of information into one place and jump between different pieces of information. So if it's important, for example, that I can find how NVDA is doing on a particular market, and that relates to one of these other charts, you should make it interrelated. You should make it possible for them to jump between them. I'm not certain. Each of these individual charts, right, is its own exercise in data visualization. But together, there's a whole different problem, which is that there are so many of them, and it's not really clear, for example, to me, how they are related to one another. So it might be useful on a page like this to actually give a summary of what somebody's looking at, right? This could help somebody who's new to the field, right? And it could also just give a screen reader user or a low vision user some information about how to, how to interpret what they're looking at. What pieces of information should they correlate manually? How should they interpret each of these individual things? And then, each individual item, you've got line chart, candlestick chart, you've got heat maps, block diagrams, and then you have a bunch of data tables, more line charts, bar charts, et cetera, et cetera. But giving somebody an overview of how to interpret this might be a useful first step. Yeah, that's what I would say about that one. Here we have a stock chart, and I'm going to say one thing specifically about this. Actually, this is reflected on the previous chart as well. This little dip right here, right? These little dips. They've set a threshold, right here. I believe that's probably some sort of threshold that they're setting, or maybe it's a key index. I'm not sure, but where this line crosses over, if you're doing sonification, it might be, for example, one technique would be to, where it crosses that line, to change how they're doing, like just to give, like in order to convey that it's crossing over some threshold, right, or some index. Change the type of tone that you're using, change the type of the sound that you're using. That would be one good thing. If you're using haptics, that line itself is itself, somebody could go over and feel it. Like you're either haptics or tactiles, they'd be able to feel that change, right? But another sonification technique would simply be, when something crosses over a threshold, give somebody an ear con. Okay, this thing has passed over. Letting somebody set thresholds is actually a really useful technique, because it's very actionable and it's very specific to that user. That person knows what their tolerances are, what their thresholds are. And in general, giving users the ability to set the things that they are interested in. Personalization is really key thing in accessibility. A really key technique in accessibility, personalization. I don't know that there's much specific like this. Mona, we talked about this one briefly before. As somebody who doesn't dabble in the markets, I don't know what information I'm supposed to be getting here. Having some simple explanation of why this is important might be useful. that's a pretty obvious UX thing, right?
Mhm.
But if I'm like, should I be following the line? Should I be following the difference between is it the differentials that are important? Is it, what is this chart trying to tell me? And what actions do I want to take from this chart? It doesn't matter how accessible you make the chart. It, 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 if the person interpreting the chart doesn't know how to interpret it, you can use all sorts of fancy accessibility techniques, but unless you're telling them what they're looking at and telling them what to look for, it's not going to be useful. Keep in mind that a lot of blind people, for example, have just ignore data visualizations because they haven't been accessible for, like, if they never learned how to use the data visualization, and they may never have, if they were born blind or they had low vision from an early age, like very low vision, they may not even be familiar with charts that to us seem very straightforward.
Mhm.
So being pretty explicit about things is useful. Like here, you might just give them, rather than forcing them to like explore the data visualization themselves, if you just gave them a summary of, the relationship between these lines, that would tell them whether it was worth their while, worth their time to invest in looking at the individual data points, right? If there's nothing remarkable here, then they can just skip it without investing the amount of time it would take for them to explore the interface. This is why summaries of charts are really, really useful, and that's why we're working on what we're working on, right?
Mhm.
It's to respect the user's time, let them know whether this is something they would be interested in drilling down into in detail.
No, that definitely makes sense.
And I don't know if there was any particular thing we had to talk about on this final one. My computer's being slow. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. So,
yeah, I think this just comes back down to the dashboard advice. Let's move on.
Sure thing. So I was going to say, so we've covered the charting examples, and we've covered better practices, considerations to keep in mind when we're looking at different types of charts. And you did just touch on it on the end right there, but how can we make charts more interactive, and maybe what is a better approach, or what are some better practices?
So before I tell you about better practices, I'd like to talk about worse practices. I have seen this particular example called out in several different places. The original, I tracked it down. The original was by somebody, I'm not going to name names, but several years ago, there is a piece of advice that comes from W3C, the Web Standards Organization, a piece of very bad advice that says, okay, it's not bad advice. It's bad advice under certain circumstances. It's bad advice when used indiscriminately. Do not distinguish important items by color alone. And so here you see that they have taken this example, or this premise, very literally, and they have said, well, we're not just going to use color, black and blue for these charts. We're going to add a pattern to it. Now, this can be useful for tactile stuff, right? Where somebody is moving their finger over it. Mm-hmm. That's great. But purely visually, this is a shada. Like my opening salvo here is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how accessible is this? Like, how likely are you, a designer, somebody making a chart, how likely are you to use this technique? How likely it is for your brand or design lead to let you use this technique? Like, how attractive do you feel like this is? And personally, I think this is a really good example of um, an optical illusion, but is not a great example of a bar chart. Then we have to ask ourselves, who is this for? Is this for people with color blindness, people with low vision, people who are blind? And again, for tactile, maybe. Is it for people with 1980s nostalgia? Uh, you're too young for that, but anybody my age or older will notice the patterns. And I see this as an anti-pattern, not a pattern, right? This is, I call the pattern anti-pattern. What harm does it do? So it might trigger vestibular spectrum disorder, especially when scrolling. Somebody might actually have a seizure because of something like this. It certainly makes the heart chart harder to read for more people. And let me specifically, from a cognitive load theory, point out why is it harder? Is because rather than having 6 individual bars, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have dozens of elements, dozens of individual things that we are visually having to process in order to look at this, right? Like, there's just dozens and dozens of segments in this line, right? And even though we can abstractly say, oh, this is one bar, right? Our visual system is busy with that, right? And the biggest danger for me is that this is misleading guidance that distracts from real accessibility solutions. Please do not use patterns. Like, use patterns only rarely if you can. It also adds unnecessary constraints on top of color. Use good colors, right? Good contrasting colors. Somebody with color blindness is not going to mistake blue and black. That's not a thing, right? Somebody with low contrast vision is still going to be able to see the difference between these different shades, right? Between the black and the blue. This doesn't help anybody, right? And it distracts people, and it makes people think that accessibility, especially accessibility of data visualization, has to be ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're less likely to use it, right? They're less likely to care about it. So I think that it gives accessibility an ugly name, right? This is the sort of thing we shouldn't do. So why am I picking on this example? It's because I found it on a 2018 Medium post, Accessible Colors for Data Visualization, which was picked up by Keen, an event streaming platform. And then in 2021, Smashing Magazine added it as a complete guide to accessible front-end components, right? This same image, right? And they didn't really think, no offense to any of them, they thought that they were doing the right thing, because ultimately this is based on an example from W3C itself, which is a very bad example. W3C should know better. But blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to say something like this is a much better, much more easily interpreted bar chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
I felt relief when I go from this to this, right? People are already maybe already stressed about like interpreting the data. Don't add stressors to them. All right, so that's my rant on on the pattern anti-pattern. Some real techniques that you can use. Making controls, making data visualization. First off, step 1, provide a summary. Respect your users, your readers' time. Provide a summary of what the chart has to say. If you can't provide, if it's exploratory rather than explanatory, tell them how to use it. Tell them how to interpret it. Tell them what meaningful things they can look for. If it's explanatory, just give them give them the story, tell them verbally what, like textually, what story you're telling them. Then do allow them to drill into it, right? Don't make them trust you, right? Do give them the tools. There's techniques with, in addition to alt text, there's things like ARIA Live and, there's very, without getting too technical, there are ARIA techniques that you can use to, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a specific kind of vocabulary that you can use in your markup in your like HTML SVG markup to let a blind person know how to interpret certain things. I don't want to get too technical, but I will say that's actually an important point. I could talk. So basically, you can let them drill down into, like, you can base level. If you don't want to invest in accessible data visualizations, provide a data table. Like, that's the simplest thing you can do. And if a data table, we have already seen how data tables are not as good as, for example, line charts, right, for interpreting data. But if that's the best you can do, it's better than nothing. And you should definitely at least do that. You should also, if you can, use a data visualization library that allows a user to explore each individual, series or data, any individual data point, drill down into the data the same way that you would with a mouse or trackpad touchscreen. So I think that's going to lead me to sort of one of my final points here, which is make sure when you are provisioning when you're buying some data visualization software, because most of you are not in the business of making data visualization software. You're in the business of making tools for investment. You're in the business of whatever you're in the business of. Like, you're probably not making your tools specifically. You're not making your own data visualization library, probably. Mm-hmm. So just make sure that when you are buying the software that you are going to be using, make sure that you're using software. Ask the question, how accessible is this? Can a screen reader, what specific things have you enabled for a screen reader user, for a low vision user? Just do some due diligence on figuring out what particular, the library has done to make their interface accessible. You're probably in the financial market. The people making your charting software probably aren't in the financial market, right? So there's specific things that apply to the financial market that are different than other kinds of general data visualization. See if they looked at those. If they did, ask them, well, how are you specifically enabling, like that example with candlestick plot, right? How are you enabling people to make actionable, decisions on financial data using your charts? And if they haven't looked at that specifically, maybe you should do some user research yourself, right? Your market. Find out who your users are and commission a study. It's not that expensive to commission a study for accessibility, and for ill or for good, you may be legally obligated to do so, right? I don't try to emphasize. I try to be the fireman and not the cop. I don't want to tell people you got to do this because it's the law, but you got to do this because it's the law. there have been a lot of an increasing number of lawsuits against websites that are being won by people who have disabilities saying I can't access your data. You know, personally, I do it because it's the right thing to do. If you're watching a talk on accessibility and data visualization, you already think it's the right thing to do. I don't need to convince you, right? If you reach this point in the conversation, I don't need to convince you. But if you need to convince your boss, here's a handy chart for them. This is from Forrester Research. This is estimates of the relative cost of rework. Let's just say that you, at the point at which any kind of rework has to be done, right? But accessibility is specific. But if you don't have accessibility in at the design and architecture step, it's going to cost you 5 times more at the implementation step. It's going to cost you 10 times more at the integration test step. By the time you get to customer beta test, 15 times more expensive to go back and rework something. Again, this is not specifically about accessibility, but this is just about rework, right? But it pertains to accessibility. And when you've released a product, set aside any lawsuit that you're going to get, right? Just your cost of making your thing more accessible is going to cost 30 times as much as if you had started with it. So accessibility goes in at the start, not at the end, right? Start with your data viz software, pick accessible chart software. Worst case, make a hidden table, design with progressive enhancement in mind, involve people with disabilities in the process of creating things, including cognitive disabilities in the design, not just the testing phase. Try to get people with disabilities on the ground floor. And any audits you do should just confirm what you already know. But chances are you're not just getting started, right? You're somewhere further down the line here, but it's never too late to start. Especially if we all go through cycles, right? Like even if you've got a post product release, you're going to be changing up your software, right? So start putting start your accessibility journey sort of for your next sprint at the beginning, right? And that's I could give you specific techniques for making your charts accessible, but probably you should just make sure that the software that you're using is accessible. Don't try to hack somebody else's, don't try to take some other charting software that's not accessible and make it accessible yourself. That is a recipe for disaster. Find some software that was designed to be accessible from the get-go.
I think that's solid advice and a perfect point to close the interview. So I want to thank you so much, Doug, for being here and for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Mona, for inviting me. And let me know if you have any questions, comments, and that's it. I'm always, as I said, I'm not a financial services expert. But I'm always interested to, if somebody has like a particular question or comment, I'm happy to, have a conversation about, hey, how would you do this particular thing?
Mm-hmm. And if anybody's interested in Fizz Studio, they can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.